Fasten your seatbelt and prepare for takeoff. My guest today is Robert Delaurentis, pilot, author, sought-after speaker. As a pilot, he circumnavigated the globe in a single-engine Malibu Mirage, the Spirit of San Diego, and last year completed a polar circumnavigation, flying first south over Antarctica and then around the globe to the North Pole on a mission of global peace in his twin-engine turboprop airplane called the Citizen of the World. He has a docuseries in the making of that journey. I'm honored to have you here as a guest on my conversations with messengers on a mission, Robert.
Well, I'm honored to be here, Susan. You know, you were instrumental in all those things. And without your help and support, I probably wouldn't be here, right?
Well, we've done pilot and co-pilot together because it's been a journey that probably neither one of us could have done without the other. But it's sometimes it takes more than one, right? And we'll get into that because you created quite a team for your last your polar circumnavigation. But what I want to do is go all the way back to the very beginning of this journey, to when you flew up what was then a rented Cirrus plane. It was to spend a VIP weekend with me. That was back in 2015. And we wanted to discuss what was next in your life. You really had this yearning to do something because you were flying a lot for a low-time pilot and going great distances like the Caribbean and Alaska. And you'd built a very successful real estate business, but there was something now that was calling you to make a difference. Do you remember us going for walks and talking about this? Take us back to that time.
I think it might have been as early as 2014, Susan. But yeah, I basically had some success in business and came to realize that, you know, there was more to life than just making money. And I wanted to have some impact on the world. So we had been talking about some branding and giving back in the areas that I was passionate about. And that was business, aviation, and spirituality, which of course you introduced me to all those things years before. But yeah, I came up, I was starting to venture out in terms of my flying. And on that weekend, we started, you know, a project that would last for 8 years now, right? You know, it was the branding, it was the website, it was logo design, it was a lot of dreaming.
Yeah, I can feel your emotion because you are so involved. This is Flying Through Life, which was the brand that we created. And then the first book that was written, which I've got a copy of it here. Let's see, camera, there we go, Flying Through Life. Right. That set the stage for everything. Within a very short period of time, you did the circumnavigation in the Malibu Mirage. You came back and we built the social media, your website, your social media, to a teeming number of people that were like, where's the book? Where's the book? I want to buy the book. That catapulted you into what you're now considered a thought leader in the aviation community. So I can feel like that has so much power. But it was your impossible dream, right? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the thing that's interesting, I think, about all this is that it started out and, you know, a lot of people just do one book or one circumnavigation and then they're done. And as we continued to move forward to pursue what we described as the impossibly big dream in Flying Through Life, we started to realize that there was more work to be done. And, you know, what we had done was really a foundation for bigger and bigger things. And certainly the polar circumnavigation was many times more difficult than the equatorial circumnavigation. You know, I always thought I would be finished in a few years, but this has really grown into much more, you know, with global impact. You know, some of the measuring sticks are the docuseries and the books and the children's books and the coloring books and, you know, being on the United Nations website and presenting, you know, for so many distinguished groups and just
Smithsonian, to name one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Yeah. But could you ever have imagined back when we started this in 2014, you're right, because 2015 was the actual circumnavigation. So we had already started on the book prior to that. Could you ever have imagined that it would grow to the level that it's grown, and we know it's growing even further?
No, I did not. And, that's true with my business as well, that's benefited from a lot of this. I think my life ambition was to have a house with a white picket fence. And then that was kind of it. Quite honestly, that's when I was growing up. So yeah, reality is exceeded my expectations.
Well, you are somebody, Robert, because we've worked together now, as you said, for 8 years. You're somebody who is always reaching for the next level. The first book, Flying Through Life, started to people to see you, and you would go to the airplane gatherings like Fun and Sun and Oshkosh, and you weren't really recognized at that point. You weren't really seen for what you had in your heart to accomplish, because there were other people who had done, not in the Malibu Mirage, but other people who had done a circumnavigation. So you've always been stretching. Let's talk about the stretch when you moved from the single engine plane to the twin engine, and then all the preparations that you did to do the pole to pole navigation. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, when we rolled into the polar circumnavigation, the planning, I think everybody expected it would be about the same amount of time as the equatorial circumnavigation, which took about 6 months to plan, I believe about 4 months to fly. So realistically, I thought, we have more sponsors, we have more experience, we have a bigger budget, and we have a bigger team. So this should, it's going to be harder, but it'll roll off in about the same amount of time. And of course, the universe came back and humbled all of us many times. And what we expected would be planned and executed in a year ended up taking 3 years. And if you include the docuseries, that's going to push it a little bit further too. So, the journey you start on is not necessarily the one you finish. Sometimes it grows to be, so much more.
Yeah. When we first started talking about including peace, or making peace the banner for the citizen of the world, the second plane that we're talking about that you were preparing, the idea was that the North Pole and the South Pole are the only places on the planet that's never had a war. And so in a time of upheaval, and again, when you were doing this planning, if I get my years right, it must have been 2017 and 2018, because you started the journey at the end of 2019. But during all that, there was upheaval around the world then. There's certainly upheaval now. And the mission that you were on to spread the idea of peace, let's talk about that, and how you began to discover what the peace really meant when you were holed up in Spain, couldn't continue on the journey at that point because COVID was keeping you in lockdown.
It was kind of like somebody rolled a grenade into the room during the trip. And I remember, after completing that South Pole leg, going, wow, the rest of this is going to be a global victory lap, because the hardest part of the trip was done. And, I had a familiar place to go to, which was Europe, where I've flown and you've flown, before. And got to Spain, was living in the monastery in Montserrat with the monks. And then the quarantine hit, and Spain would become the epicenter for the pandemic in Spain. And I remember getting kicked out of the monastery because I wasn't a monk, and they were just reducing it to the monks there, driving to the airport to leave, and pulled over. There was an internet connection, and we had a conversation about whether I should hunker down, thousands of miles away from home and, endure it, or just retreat to the United States and leave the plane behind. And I remember, you encouraging me to stay.
Yeah.
And we did that because we felt it would have, the most impact it possibly could. And that's why we embarked on this mission of global peace, to connect the two places on the planet where peace has always existed. And of course, that would unfold over the next, I think I was there in Spain after that for another month and a half, 2 months, just trying to get out of the country and having the experience and sharing it with people in the United States. So it was not a global victory lap. It was filled with many more challenges. And that's what I was referring back to when I said, the journey you finish is not the one you start.
But let's talk a little bit to give the context of what happened for you while you were in lockdown. And it was constantly, can you get out? And when can you get out? And what should we do? And it was an evolution, it wasn't the straight journey. But let's talk about the internal journey that happened during that time.
It's funny because last night I was on a website looking at properties in Sitges, Spain, seeing if I could, identify some of the places where I was. It was, after the South Pole, we realized that this was also an inner journey, that in order to find peace in the world, you had to find it in yourself. And actually, that's an even bigger mission. Because there are people, you take Eckhart Tolle, he sat on a park bench for 2 years to find his inner peace. And we didn't have 2 years. I didn't even know if I was up for that. But there was just a remarkable series of coincidences that happened that helped me focus inwardly. And one of them was I eventually ended up in what was advertised as a Zen villa up on top of a mountain overlooking Sitges. And I was, by myself. And it was during that time, I think I did find my inner peace because, a lot of the things that I had been defining myself by out in the world, I was not getting that anymore because I was by myself. I was in a foreign country, wasn't really interacting with many people. I realized how few things that I really needed to survive and to be happy. I let go of my ego, I think, because there was nothing to define myself by. It wasn't the car I was driving, the clothes I was wearing, the things I was doing. I was locked down. And, there was a lot of silence. There was a lot of meditation. There was a lot of reflection. There was a lot of trying to figure out what had happened, and what was important to me in life. So that was, turned out to probably be one of the most rewarding parts of the trip. Maybe excluding the North and South Pole crossings. But, when I reflect back, it's probably one of the most peaceful times in my life.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that, as you're saying, if COVID hadn't happened in the way that it did, you could have just gone through Spain and continued on the journey, that chunk that really helped you get more clear about what peace really is would never have happened. And I think that's such a great example that sometimes when we're stopped, you mentioned earlier about how some people will do a circumnavigation and then they're done, but you continue to grow and you've continued to push the outer limits of that growth. But within pushing those limits, in a sense, that's what you did when you were holed up in Spain, because you found the inward, like the limits that we put on ourselves that keep us from being happy and finding joy because we think it's out there. So it was such a blessing to have that happen. It didn't feel like that at the time. I know that was a very stressful time in other ways.
Rumi, the famous Persian poet, talks about reconnecting with your joy because we're all born with it. So it was really, about removing those barriers to joy that I had erected, that people erect, to prevent them from that. And certainly had those moments, waking up. Actually, at times I felt badly because I thought other people in the world were suffering, but, I'm having this magical experience. But, there doesn't have to be suffering to have learning. And that's, the concept of ease and grace.
What I often see, and I certainly see it in you, I see it with each book, I see it with each endeavor that you take, is the person you are when you start it. When you first start, like when we go way back to us finding the brand, flying through life, writing the book to support that brand. You came out the other side a different person. And then you continued that journey, and then writing the book Zen Pilot, where you documented all the hurdles that you faced on that journey. And I can't wait for us to finish Peace Pilot, because that also, there's just this continual transformation that takes place. But it takes place because you're willing to show up for it. It takes place because you're in that adventure.
Yeah, and it's not to say there's not going to be a bunch of turbulence.
Yeah. We know that one.
I don't know that I honestly would have set out on this journey if I knew how difficult it would be. And I think the universe does that for you, because that you're intended to learn these lessons. And if you were afraid, you wouldn't embark on them. So they start off a little slower, and then they get to be much, much more. And I just remember when I was crossing the Drake Passage, low on fuel, thinking to myself, my God, what am I being tested for? How hard does this have to be? But I think, as the next projects start to unfold, it makes us stronger. And, certainly we're here to learn too.
I think about when I first soloed in my little rented Cessna 172, the idea that I was up there by myself, and that it was only under my ability that I was going to get that plane back where it was supposed to be, and on the ground, there's something very empowering that happens. And I see that with every new challenge that you take, is you become more confident in the world. And it's the universe supporting you, and you being willing to show up for it, as I mentioned before. You mentioned the Drake Passage, and we haven't talked at all about the flight over Antarctica in the pole-to-pole navigation. That was in, let me get this right, was that December of 2019?
Yeah, December 19th, 2019.
Yeah.
Hey, but before you get on to that, Susan,
Yes.
I want to say that on that first trip, you were with me for a little bit of the time in Europe. And I remember flying, and I was sort of phasing in and out, like dream and reality. And I remember thinking, wow, this is my dream life. I'm in my plane. I'm flying in a foreign country. You were there. We were having an adventure. It was beautiful. And then I was like having a hard time distinguishing whether I was dreaming or if that was reality. And, sometimes the dream is more real than the reality. And I know that sounds a little heady, but, that's kind of why we're doing this stuff. We're pursuing our dreams. And then when you find out you're actually living it, it's pretty wild,
Yeah. I've just changed the banner on the YouTube channel from making the focus on Susan Gilbert to making the focus on messengers on a mission. And the tagline is "Where dreams take flight."
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm flying right now, actually, here, right?
That's right. You got your turboprop about. Let's talk about first, even before the Drake Passage. Let's talk about all the modifications you made on the Twin Commander to feel that you could competently, that the aircraft could competently do what was necessary to do the Antarctica flight.
Well, there was a guy who had done a similar trip in a very small piston plane, who was an airline pilot, who told me he didn't think that the Commander could do it. And honestly, I didn't know that the Commander could do it either. We had a test flight, or I had a test flight in Mojave, and Robert Morgan, a brilliant engineer who formerly worked with Scaled Composites, took some of my test data and did some calculations. But yeah, I just was intent on making every modification that could be made to that plane to increase the speed, the altitude, and the range. And then with that, I thought I would go out into the world and give it a try. And I think the first point that I actually had some amount of confidence is when the plane lifted off the runway at Ushuaia, and I was expecting to climb or to fly in the ground effect for up to 50 nautical miles out the Drake, or out the Beagle Channel to the Drake Passage. And when I lifted off the runway, which I wasn't sure would even lift off the runway, the plane started to climb at 1,800 feet per minute, which is tremendous. You know, most piston planes can't even do that. So with that heavy fuel load, you know, I thought, wow, maybe this is going to work. But I had 18.1 hours to figure it out, right?
Yeah, you did. So let's talk about some of the things that you anticipated: the temperature in the air in Antarctica, the altitude that you would be at, the amount of fuel that was needed on the aircraft, and what you did to modify the aircraft so that you were carrying that much fuel. You want to go over a little bit of those details, because I think that will give context for when you share with us what actually happened.
Sure. Well, one of the biggest modifications was installing 6 extra fuel tanks for a total of 10. And then there was 20 valves that controlled the movement of fuel both into the tanks and then out of the tanks into the wing. And that process was complicated by the fact that there was a pressure chamber that, you know, the pilot stays in. So you had to, you know, go beyond that into the wing. You also had to heat fuel, because the outside air temperature at one point was minus 60 Celsius, and the gelling point of Jet A1 is minus 47 Celsius. And then add to that the Predator B drone engines, the Honeywells, were only designed to go to minus 53. So, you know, there was so many opportunities for failure there. And, you know, as you know, later on in the trip, 2 of the fuel tanks burst, one time spraying fuel into my eyes and on my chest and arms and legs and groin. Navigation was another huge one, because I knew at the North and South poles I would lose navigation. That included magnetic, GPS, and what I eventually realized over the North Pole, which I thought would be easier, it turned out to be worse. And I didn't have attitude, heading, and reference, which is which way is up, which way is Alaska. They call it ADAHRS. Didn't have GPS, autopilot because of the loss of the ADAHRS, comms, of course, and magnetic compass for 5 hours. So, you know, that's a pretty scary thing, to be 5 hours away from land over the North Pole and not knowing which way is home. And knowing that with the reliability of those engines and props, my misery would be prolonged, you know, for up to 7 hours, because I had 7 hours of fuel left. And of course, this was all being tracked by 66 Iridium NEXT satellites using Arion as well. So, you know, that was documented, the moments of indecision out there, and you know, just sort of a little bit of that wandering.
Yeah, it is interesting that we thought Antarctica, and I do want to go back to that for just a minute, but we thought that could be the worst that it could be. And then it was after that when you were in, trying to think of where it was in Africa. It's northern coastal Africa, but where those fuel tanks exploded.
And the second one was Malmo, Sweden.
Yes. Yeah, that did happen a second time. And so, but then leaving Sweden, and then you do the North Pole, like you said, you thought, okay, journey's almost over. North Pole's going to be easy. And then you had the experience that you just described. So, you know, it's, you're right. We never know what the adventure will bring, but going into it and doing it the best that we can with the knowledge that we have, and knowing that, and I know that you feel this way, that whatever happens is still part of the mission and what's to happen, so to speak. Let's go back to Antarctica for just a second, because you and I were in text communication with each other, and you'd done the victory lap around Antarctica. You communicated with the base camp. What was the man's name? Do you remember?
Oh, you mean Michel Gordillo, who was?
No, this is on Antarctica, when you did the victory lap there, and you were in communication with Corey. Yeah. And so then, you know, you're like, okay, this is great. Now I'm going to head home. and you realize like the fuel hadn't frozen, like all the things that could have happened, and you're headed home and you're not sure that you have enough fuel to get back.
Yeah, what happens basically is to get, to the South Pole, when you're heavy, you've got to burn more than half your fuel. So, I knew the plane would fly faster, and I also was relying on a 100-knot tailwind to push me along. And I had pursued that tailwind on the way down and was not able to pick it up. I was heading off the western, portion of the Antarctic Peninsula, and then finally decided to turn direct because I was going so far off course. At the South Pole, I then picked up, the tailwind, but the problem was it slowly started to drop off. And by the time I got to the Drake Passage, which is the worst weather in the world, where that Chilean C-130 had gone down a week before and, killed all 36 people on board, the tailwind was gone. And it was kind of like being in the twilight zone, because time sort of would stop, because as you lose tailwind, the time it takes you to get to your destination remains constant as it drops off, right? Because you're going slower, so therefore it's taking longer. And you can actually watch the GPS, just the time anticipated not change. And I sent you a text message saying, I don't think I'm going to make it.
Yeah. But you did.
I did.
But you did, and you continued on the journey. You flew me over to South Africa to make sure that we were on message with the docuseries that was being filmed, and to spend some time with you on the journey. And my last stop with you was Ethiopia, which was amazing. Of course, I don't know that we'll get into the Madagascar trip that we were just ahead of a cyclone. But it's one of those things you never want to find yourself in. But it was when I left you in Ethiopia, and then you continued up into Europe. And of course, we know we were starting to see it even in Ethiopia. Remember when we landed from Nairobi? But you remember the person coming out in like the white hazmat suit and taking our temperature?
Yes.
And it was like, what's that about? Well, it's because they knew that COVID was making its way west, and we weren't aware yet of what was going on, but you certainly found that as you moved on into Europe.
So what I find interesting about that too is that cyclone out of Madagascar was so dangerous that one of the 5 flight simulations that I wrote for Redbird flight simulators, they didn't want to use it because they felt it was too risky, even to be done on a simulator.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the things I want to talk about. But before we get in there, and remind me, we're going to come back to the flight simulator. Share with everybody some of the science that you carried on the Citizen of the World on this pole-to-pole journey as part of a mission of gathering data that will help the world.
Right. We wanted it to have some scientific benefit to the planet. First thing was the NASA wafer scale spaceship, which was about that big. And I carried it on the co-pilot side window just aft of the pilot seat there. And the idea was that it could be shot out into space using an electromagnetic cannon, and it would eventually capture 700,000 images of the planet, would measure the location, the temperature, and the speed of the aircraft. And the intention was in the future that they would not have to send astronauts into space. They could use these wafer scale spaceships and not have to lift the heavy fuel and rocket motors into space as well. The second thing was a biofuel experiment, and the biofuel experiment used biofuels over the North and South Pole. So I would turn those on just before crossing each of the poles for about 30 minutes. And it was the first time in history that biofuels have been used over the North and South Poles. The other thing was a plastic particle experiment for the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And that was to check for microfibers in the atmosphere all the way around the planet, because they had found the microfibers on the ground, even at the poles, and in the water all over the planet. So it would connect those two cycles with the air, which is the way they think the microfibers are spread. And then finally, there was an ADS-B out experiment, because it was used to track the aircraft all the way around the planet, including over the poles.
And so recently, just a couple of months ago, you were at the annual NBAA, National Business Aircraft Association. Do I have that acronym correct? And you were there with the Citizen of the World, where it was on display with all of these modifications that were made and these experiments that were conducted. But let's talk about Redbird then, because you had the Redbird simulator going there at the conference as well, right?
Right. And at that point, we had just one of the 4 programmed in, but people were able to come up and experience some of the intensity, of flying the South Pole. And it, it's narrated by me, so you hear my voice, and it's pretty terrifying, at times. It's pretty intense.
And how many more? I know that they're in process, but how many more flight plans will there be from your trip?
3 more, a total of 4, and those will be available on every Redbird simulator globally for free. And there are a lot of Redbird flight simulators out there in the thousands, and a lot of them are in museums. So, when I go back this coming summer to the Smithsonian with the plane, I'm hoping that we can have that set up and on display.
Yeah. And the reason, that's all of these things are just really interesting and phenomenal. But what I keep coming back to is like, who to think? Who to think? Think of all the people who are experiencing your journey through the simulators. And when we started, Redbird is one of your sponsors. Who would ever have thought that all this, it just keeps mushrooming, because it's what you focus on will expand. Your focus has been straight on with your mission and with the expansion of yourself as an individual and with the expansion of your aviation endeavors. And it just keeps compounding more and more and more. Do you want to talk about any of the other sponsors that have been involved? You mentioned Honeywell.
Yes, certainly Honeywell. There was 95 sponsors in all. MT Propeller was a huge one.
Yeah, we see the propeller. We see that great, what is it, 5-blade? Give me the whole lingo there.
5-bladed nickel tip scimitar composite prop.
There it is. We see it right there.
Yeah, certainly, there's many. Lightspeed headsets. Aero Air helped us with a windshield for the plane. Artcraft Paint, would eventually paint the outside of the plane. We had Wheelan LED lights. We had Avidyne Avionics and L3 Avionics as well. There was a tremendous number of companies.
Yeah. And the biofuel?
Gulfstream actually provided that. At the last minute, if you recall, I was calling around, and they decided to help me out. That was awesome.
Yeah. Which again, another beautiful benefit that comes with having the platform that you do. You write blogs for AOPA as a thought leader, but having the platform that you have the ability to make all of these things available to people, like the flight simulator for free. The sponsors were part of your team's support to be able to make this happen. And so it's been a very, very big collaborative project.
Certainly, a mission like this is what I like to say, a mission of many. And literally there was over 100 people just as sponsors, but then there's the team, right?
Yes.
Of about 10. And then, there's the angels that we call them, just the people individually who wanted to help.
Yeah. And they showed up for you all around the world during your whole journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, it's taken several years. It hasn't been an overnight thing, even though it may appear to be on the surface, but we just continue, and it's building momentum. And I know when that docuseries or documentary, whatever form it ends up taking, gets out there in the world, that we're going to jump outside of aviation, and a lot more people will learn about the adventure.
Yes. There's so many personal limitations that have been removed through these experiences for you. And that can help people far more than in aviation, even though aviation has been your plane and your journey has been the vehicle for it. What are you doing right now in terms of expanding your aviation acuity? You went from single engine to twin engine, and you have so many different licenses right now, but let's talk about what's happened most recently.
Well, most recently, I moved up to the Pacific Northwest, and this is sort of a float plane mecca up here. So I ended up buying a wonderful Cessna 182 on Aeroset floats, and I learned how to fly it. I've been flying around to different lakes here in Washington and Idaho, and the intention is to take it up into Canada and Alaska this coming summer when things warm up a little bit, and have that flying experience.
It's a whole different thing, isn't it? I mean, that's all that I've ever known personally is the Cessna 182 and co-pilot in your different planes, but it's just a whole different type of flying. I got such a kick out of you explaining learning how to land, and the analogy that I had in my mind was like the way that ducks land, and they come in, and the process that you've learned landing on water versus on a runway. And what's the name of this new plane?
It's the Swan.
Yes.
And,
yes.
We have big plans for her. It's certainly a way to accumulate some hours in the plane, but it's also probably going to be a step to something even bigger.
Yeah.
And then most recently, I got my tailwheel endorsement and checked out in a AT6, actually a SNJ6, which is affectionately known as the T6 Texan. So it's a warbird trainer.
Yeah. And then as you continue on your mission, you're going to be in which magazine? You're on the cover of?
Actually, we made the cover of Twin and Turbine magazine, and coming up in March, there's a full-length story in AOPA's Turbine edition.
There you go.
Which I'm very proud of, because AOPA has been one of the major supporters of the trip. And part of the reason I did the trip when I did was to help celebrate AOPA's 80th anniversary. I've certainly, been blogging for them. They've done articles and videos on me. It's a wonderful organization, and they don't just support me, of course. Every pilot out there knows about them.
Yeah. And going back to that weekend with the story that we first began with here, you were flying these long distances to the Caribbean, to Alaska, when I know as a low-time pilot, I didn't fly much further. I mean, I flew from San Diego up to San Francisco. I flew over to Palm Springs and Yuma, Arizona. But other than that, I mean, I just didn't stretch past that area. And that's very common, that most single engine small planes, Cessna 172s, 182s, they stay in an area, but you were taken off. You were, and people would ask you at the FBOs, they would say, well, how are you doing that? And would you come to speak about that? And I remember saying to you, and I say it to so many people, well, if you want to speak, you need to be an author. And if you're an author, you need to speak. And then having a brand, a message that people understand what represents you. And we did that, and look what's happened.
Well, it's not just, doing that, it's also the evolution that comes with that.
Exactly.
And as you know, Zen Pilot was a pretty good commercial success in terms of a book and branding, but now it's evolving into Peace Pilot, because there's a bigger mission ahead for us.
Yes. Well, I hope to see both the book Peace Pilot and the docuseries, whether it's named Peace Pilot or something different, but I would imagine it will be named the same in 2022. And I'd love to have you come back and give us an update on that journey when that happens. Would you like to do that?
Absolutely, anytime.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to share before we close?
Just to thank you, Susan, for, your contribution. I don't think that people realize how important it is to have somebody who's got a different perspective than they do to help guide them. And you can see mine is somewhat elevated here in this picture, but it also takes somebody else with a different perspective to help guide. And I certainly couldn't have done a fraction of all this without your help and support. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's been my honor, and I can't wait to see what unfolds next.